Ariane serves as the Assistant Policy Director for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC. She has served as the Policy Director for the Organic Farming Research Foundation and Policy Advocate for both organizations. She is a published author and has worked on and conducted research on organic and conventional farms in the U.S. and Europe. Ariane coordinates NSAC's policy campaigns, serves as a liaison between the grassroots and policy staff, and staffs several program areas, including organic and food safety issues. She holds a BA and a Master of Environmental Management from Yale University. Ariane.
Hi, thanks so much, Jeff. Welcome, everybody. I'm looking forward to our presentation today, and I'm going to be speaking with you about FDA's proposed new Food Safety Modernization Act rules. Jeff, would you mind please forwarding the slide? Thank you. So today's presentation is going to focus on sustainable food systems and the Food Safety Modernization Act proposed rules. These are significant rules, they're very big rules, and we're still very much in the process of analysis. So today I'm going to hope to give you an overview of the major concerns and issues associated with the rules and the comment campaign moving ahead. Slide. Before I do that, I just wanted to spend a minute talking about who NSAC is. NSAC, so the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, is an alliance of grassroots organizations that advocates for federal policy reform to advance the sustainability of agriculture, food systems, natural resources, and communities. It was started in 1988, and we're over 90 member organizations strong from across the country. And many of our organizations work directly with small and mid-sized farms, sustainable farms, organic farmers, and on-farm processors who are going to be significantly impacted by these rules. And it's really with that in mind that NSAC has engaged in the national food safety debate. Slide. Before I get into the nuts and bolts, though, I wanted to spend a minute on our approach to food safety and how we approach policymaking around food safety. Essentially, we start from the principle that everyone has a role in ensuring safe food. And this means everyone from the farmer and farm worker to the consumer and everyone in between. That our food supply chains are both short and long, and there are multiple different actors in them. And everyone in that supply chain does have a role in ensuring safe food. At the same time, though, we should really focus our efforts and our resources on addressing the highest risks in that supply chain. And especially in a time right now when we have limited federal resources, limited state and local resources as well to address food safety issues, we really want to focus on the highest risk. Additionally, one size does not fit all. And this is a key point for many of the farmers that we work with. If the small and mid-sized farmers that produce sustainable and organic food are going to, be able to adapt to food safety regulations and practice more or safer food handling practices and production practices, we really need to make scale-appropriate regulations, such that regulations that work for a very big farm that is growing only 1 or 2 different types of crops don't work for a small farm that's growing 50 different varieties of crops, for example. We also want to make sure that whatever practices and standards included in regulation are based on scientific evidence when possible. And this is something that's become a big issue over the past several years when certain organizations or state and local governments have tried to address food safety based on not much scientific evidence and have mandated practices that at times go against what we think of as good production practices and really have no basis in kind of advancing food safety. Slide, please. So I just want to give you an overview of the Food Safety Modernization Act. It is the first major overhaul to food safety laws since the 1930s, and it was debated in Congress between 2009 and 2010. President Obama signed the bill into law on January 4th, 2011, and the bill really included, had 4 chapters or titles, and included a number of kind of key changes to our food safety regime nationally in these titles. So Title I, as you'll see, was focused on preventing food safety problems. And within the provisions of that title, Congress told the Food and Drug Administration to come up with standards for produce safety and come up with standards for preventive controls in facilities. So any standards around safe food production and handling and processing in facilities. So those two bullet points that you see under Title I are what the proposed regulations are seeking to address and what I'll be spending the rest of the presentation focused on. But I do want to give you a little bit more of a sense of what else is in the bill. Title II is focused on detecting and responding to food safety problems. Title III is focused on improving safety of imported food. And then the fourth title or chapter of the bill focuses on miscellaneous provisions. So the Food Safety Modernization Act has a number of provisions that address sustainable agriculture and food system concerns. And these really came about through a coalition of organizations, many of them in NSAC, who sought to make sure that the regulations were based on the four principles that I mentioned earlier, but primarily the principle of being scale appropriate. So one of the provisions, and I'll be getting much more into this later on in the presentation, is the goal of having the regulations be scale appropriate and creating options for small and mid-sized farms serving local and regional markets. And from here on out, the provisions kind of associated with that overarching provision in the bill, I'll refer to as the Tester-Hagan Amendment, after the senators, Senator Tester from Montana and Senator Hagan from North Carolina, who really moved that forward through the debate when the bill was being debated in Congress. There was an amendment, and there are provisions to ensure that the bill does not undermine beneficial on-farm conservation and wildlife practices. Food safety standards should also complement and not contradict the National Organic Program regulations. Slide, please. The regulations also must minimize any extra regulations for low-risk processing that is part of value-added production. The bill also said that FDA had to streamline and reduce unnecessary paperwork for farmers and small processors. FDA had to allow farm identity preserved marketing as an option in place of government traceback controls. And then the bill also included funding for a new training program through a competitive grants program implemented at the USDA. So those were kind of the overview of the sustainable agriculture provisions in the Food Safety Modernization Act. And as I mentioned in an earlier slide, FDA is now in the process of implementing some of the regulations that were required by the Food Safety Modernization Act. And the first regulation I'm going to talk to you about is the proposed produce rule, which essentially proposes standards for growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of produce for human consumption. These standards focus primarily on microbial pathogen contamination, so the law said FDA had to also look more broadly at chemical, radiological, and physical hazards, but the agency has really honed in on, and this reflects the debates in Congress as well during the time, honed in on microbial pathogen contamination and hazards associated with that. And so these proposed regulations outline standards for personnel qualification and training, health and hygiene, agricultural water, biological soil amendments, domesticated and wild animals, growing, harvesting, packing, and holding activities, equipment, tools, building, and sanitation, and sprouts. And so what you'll see in that is, apart from the sprouts, which are a very commodity-specific set of standards, everything else is not commodity-specific. And this was one of the big points and one of the things that we'll have to make sure to defend through this proposed rule phase, because FDA could have also chosen to go commodity by commodity and require different standards for different fruits and vegetables. And there was an amendment included in the final bill that said that FDA had to minimize different standards that applied to different commodities as much as possible. Slide, please. So I wanted to spend just a minute on the exemptions and the modified requirements in the proposed produce rule. So who is covered and who is not covered? Who is not covered are farmers who grow produce that is rarely consumed raw. Because essentially FDA is trying to get rid of the microbial hazards associated with raw agricultural commodities and specifically raw fruits and vegetables. And produce that's rarely consumed raw is thought to have a kill step essentially that would kill those microbial pathogens. Produce for personal or on-farm consumption is also excluded from coverage of the law, and farms selling an annual average value of food during a 3-year period of $25,000 or less. So those are the people who are completely exempt from these standards. There are a set of modified requirements that apply to farms that qualify under the Tester-Hagen Amendment. And if you recall in an earlier slide, I said that that was the amendment that tried to make the produce rule and the next rule that I'm going to talk about a little bit more scale appropriate so that small and mid-sized farms could comply. Slide, please. So again, the concept behind the Tester-Hagen Amendment is that we want scale appropriate regulations. And in the produce standards, what that means is that if you have an average annual monetary value in the previous 3-year period of less than $500,000 and you sell the majority of your product directly to a consumer or a retail food establishment or restaurant in the same state or within a 275-mile radius, then you need to provide information on a label or sign at the point of sale. So essentially, FDA wants to make sure that that the product can be traced back to the point of sale and to the point of production. Slide, please. So that's the produce rule. The second rule that FDA is dealing with is the Preventive Controls rule. And it focuses on outlining standards for facilities that manufacture and process food for human consumption. And what we found throughout the debate and what is of concern for many people involved in food system work is that many farms actually do act also as potential processing facilities because they add value on farm to their product. And so what the FDA does in this proposed rule is that it codifies a farm mix type facility, essentially saying that there could be a farm that comes both under the produce rule that I just talked about and comes under the requirements that I'm about to talk about because that farm processes and manufactures food. So the two major requirements associated with the Preventive Controls rule are the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls, so essentially a food safety plan. And there are a number of different parts of this food safety plan, but facilities coming under coverage of the Preventive Controls rule would have to put together a food safety plan for the facility. And then the proposed Preventive Controls rule also updates good manufacturing practices. The exemptions from the Preventive Controls rule are the ones listed on the slide. There are a number of different types of exemptions, and the outright exemptions are for certain low-risk manufacturing and processing activities by small and very small businesses. And what those specific activities are, we're still kind of in the comment period about. We just submitted comments on those, but think if you're a farm and you're processing syrup to make maple syrup and sell that's considered a low-risk processing activities. So activities like that are exempt. Seafood, juice, low-acid canned foods, dietary supplements, and alcoholic beverages are exempt because they come under other standards and regulations. Activities that are within the farm definition, as the Food and Drug Administration defines farm, which includes the growing, harvesting, and packing and holding of food that I talked about before, and then certain facilities that only store packaged foods or raw agricultural commodities that are not fruits and vegetables for further processing. And then I'm going to take you through the modified requirements for facilities that qualify under the Tester-Hagen Amendment. So there's a lot on this slide because it's essentially complicated, but stick with me here for a few more minutes and then we'll open it up. We'll pass it on to Steve and open it up to questions. So you come under modified requirements in the Preventive Controls rule if you are a very small business, which FDA is proposing to define in 3 different ways. They're not set on the definition, but it's essentially a dollar amount. It's either $250,000, $500,000, or $1 million, and they haven't settled on that. Or your average annual monetary value in the previous 3-year period was less than $500,000, and you sell the majority of your product directly to a consumer or retail food establishment within the same state or within a 275-mile radius. Then the requirements that apply to you are that you have to submit documentation of your status as what they're calling a qualified facility under the Tester-Hagen Amendment, and you either have to submit documentation of compliance with other non-federal food safety laws, so state or local law, and provide notification to consumers of that on a label or a sign at the point of sale, or submit documentation essentially, identifying potential hazards and monitoring of preventive controls, which is essentially a food safety plan light. So the regulations also talk about withdrawal of these modified requirements, and when you come out of compliance with these modified exemptions, and that is when there's a direct link to an active investigation of an outbreak, or, and I took this straight from the rules because I think it's important for people to understand that there is also a provision that says if the Secretary of Health and Human Services, so the overseeing department of the Food and Drug Administration, determines that it is necessary to protect the public health and prevent or with a qualified facility or farm that are material to the safety of food. Slide, please. So the key challenges for sustainable food systems are a lack of knowledge at FDA about farming and sustainable and organic production. They have assumption around production practices, and they do apply a factory type approach to farming, whereby they take the same types of analyses that they do for factories and try to apply those to farming systems, which are arguably more complex and have a number of other variables involved. Going on about what the exemptions to these rules really are. There are going to be challenges for producers and businesses looking to scale up, because if you're under 500,000 and you meet those other kind of requirements, then if you want to go above 500,000, you will have to come into compliance with these rules. There's a lack of adequate data to determine the impact of the rules. There's a lack of clarity around how the 2 rules interact, and there are certainly instances where a business could come under both rules. And there's a lack of funding for training, which is arguably one of the key measures for making sure that farmers are addressing food safety concerns. So NSAC is preparing a response to the rules. We do need all hands on deck to participate in what is going to be a significant comment campaign later on this spring. The comments on the proposed rules are due May 16th. We have 2 subcommittees of one of our main issue committees, the Food System Integrity Committee, doing an analysis and working on comments for these rules. And we're working with a series of legal and technical experts as well, because these are pretty challenging and complex rules. And we will be doing a major grassroots and organizational comment campaign in March, April, and early May, leading up to when the comments are due. So the link below is how you can sign up to get involved in our comment campaign, and I encourage everyone to do so. Slide. And we'll, I think, get to questions later on. Thanks so much.
We will get to questions. Thank you, Ariane. There are a number of questions for having you repeat specific facts and figures. There are a lot there. We will try to get to some of those questions, but I encourage people to review the webinar. We are recording it, and we will post it within a couple of business days, so you can re-listen to it and fast forward and rewind at will. So let me introduce you to Steve Warschauer, our food safety group gap guru. Steve Warschauer has represented the National Good Food Network's food safety interests for over 3 years. His unique perspective of being an active farmer and rancher for over 35 years, a multi-farm biodynamic CSA founder and manager, and Food Hub staff at La Montanita, New Mexico, allows him to deeply understand food safety certification from many perspectives. He also participates in the landmark United Fresh Produce-sponsored GAP harmonization effort and is an active member of NSAC's Food Safety Task Force, recently expanded to become the Food System Integrity Committee. He works on FamilyFarm.org's online food safety plan tool and serves as coordinator of the Beef Industry Improvement Initiative of New Mexico and as a member of the National Advisory Committee on Meat and Poultry Inspection. And those are just a few of his qualifications. So Steve, teach us about the work you've been doing with Group GAP certification.
Thank you, Jeff, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm trying to take control of the screen now and move the slide, so bear with me just a second. If that doesn't work, I'll pass it back to Jeff. There we go. A quick segue from the produce rule discussion to the discussion of Group GAP would be that the produce rules are coming to us as a regulatory requirement. The good agricultural practice historically has been a set of standards that have been required or requested by buyers. Generally, the larger the buyer, the more the likelihood that they would demand some kind of verification of good agricultural practices on a farm. And this helps us understand that if we're going to meet the requirements of larger buyers, what we hear out in the larger produce industry is the statement that food safety is just a cost of doing business. If you want to sell into commerce, if you want to sell into the supply chain, you've simply got to meet these requirements. And that's easy for larger businesses and larger entities to say because they have the internal resources to address those requirements. So one of the major reasons why the group approach to good agricultural practice certification was developed was to help producers of all sizes attain the benefits of scale. For example, what that means is that that within a group being certified for good agricultural practice as a group, in-house skilled technical support is developed. By having that quality of internal technical support and food safety knowledge, this, for the farmers, creates an environment of trust, an environment of access to good, timely, and applicable food safety information. It also puts more of an expert on the ground for those farmers who is interested in locally appropriate solutions. And ultimately, it creates a buffer between the farmers themselves and the external food safety interests, who could be buyers, they could be third-party auditors. One of the big problems that farmers that I hear about, and I experience myself as a farmer, is simple fear of trying to explain and demonstrate what I'm doing and why it's appropriate to someone from the outside who I can't have the same kind of relationship with because they are, although they may have the same goal of bringing my product into market, they have other interests to protect. So what happens when a group forms around good agricultural practice is that funds that that individual farmers were externalizing to pay for audits, to pay for training, to pay for that whole range of needs can to some extent be used for building internal capacity. I'm trying to keep moving the slide here. Bear with me while I get this. There we go. The group approach to GAP certification is not a new idea. It was pioneered beginning in the mid and late 90s in Europe by a global partnership for good agricultural practice called Global GAP. And around the world at this time, of 100,000 plus farms certified for good agricultural practice by Global GAP, over 90% are certified in groups. So the option of bringing farms together, forming some type of an association, and then auditing those farmers as a collective is not new. What's new is bringing it to the United States, to North America, and adapting that learning from overseas to our particular market and farm needs here in the U.S. USDA Agricultural Marketing Service began single farm audits starting in 2002. And for many of our small and mid-scale farmers, those providing food for local and regional distribution, USDA has been the go-to place for good agricultural practice auditing from that point forward. That would be over 10 years now. for USDA's involvement in the group approach to good agricultural practice, we look back to 2010 when USDA AMS engaged Good-Natured Family Farms in a pilot project working with 2 groups of Amish farmers who supplied Good-Natured Family Farms and auditing those farmers as a group. So that was the first pilot project in what will become, we hope, a growing series of more and more farms operating and being certified as groups as we create a working group certification program. In the pilot project that was conducted in 2010 and 2011 led Wallace Center to create a report. This is a very detailed document including background on the group gap approach, and a lengthy implementation guide and self-assessment tool, and then also including key lessons, next steps and recommendations, and additional resources intended to support the institutionalizing of group good agricultural practice certification in the U.S. Through a program that is being currently created within USDA AMS. What I want to do now is to go through the progress factors, the implementation steps that we describe in the group gap report. Over the last couple of years, there's been a fair amount of publicity through the NGFN and through other sources about the group approach. Different people are more or less aware of and educated about its history, but the real opportunity that we want to walk you through today is to actually acquaint you with the steps that a group would follow in order to become certified as a group, and you can utilize the learnings thus far and at this point contribute to the process of improving their group certification to meet the needs of food hubs and producer co-ops here in the U.S. What we'd like you to do is keep questions coming as we get into the nuts and bolts of the progress factors or stages of group development. Keep sending us those questions. It's probably going to be hard to stop and address them all in the webinar format, but these questions will help us eventually or shortly create a frequently asked questions guide to help people get more information and quicker answers to their questions about the group approach. The first step, what in the report we refer to as progress factors, is the step-by-step movement through a systematic process of creating support for and implementing a group certification process. So step one in almost any GAP program usually is a response to some external demand. In the food hubs, as we engage the supply chain and larger buyers, we encounter companies and organizations who require some kind of good agricultural practice evidence or certification. The first step in the group process is to evaluate whether the group feels that it can operate in relation to food safety as a group. So in essence, the first thing the group does is what we are about to do, which is walk through the whole process of forming as a group and functioning as a group, and get an idea whether it feels it has the time and can afford the cost to fully implement that program. The first thing we have to do in identifying whether we think we can function as a group is look for sources of funds. The reason why this is important is that one of the challenges of a group certification program is that in creating a group system, there are a large number of costs that have to be met up front in order to make the system function. So there has to be a source for financial support to create the program itself. Aspects of the budget process that have to be addressed are grower training. Now this is similar whether the growers are then going to be certified individually or certified as a group, but also the development of the group's quality management system. That's a cost that has to be prepared to address up front. Then additionally, because the essence of the quality management system is that the group audits and inspects itself, and a larger amount of that audit burden is now internal, which means internal auditors and inspectors are needed. So there's costs associated with training them. And then, of course, as a good agricultural practice regime is brought out to farms, on-farm improvements are identified. Almost every farm that attempts to move to get GAP certification will find that it needs to make some changes in its operation, and some of those will have costs associated with them. Of course, that particular piece, the implementation of on-farm improvements, has to be addressed whether the farms are being audited individually or whether they are working together as part of a group. It seems, though, that working together as a group can help keep that cost to a slightly lower cost per farm because of sharing of resources and working together to address different requirements. The third factor in the group process is the development of the quality management system itself. In order to develop a quality management system, a group will have to have a person, an individual, who is responsible for that quality management system. That individual is referred to as the QMS responsible person. There'll also be internal inspector and internal auditor. Now, hearing this team description, the first thing any group will think is, wow, that's 3 positions. How can that possibly be supported? Well, it actually is 3 separate functions. And in the early stages of developing a group, it's very likely that those 3 functions will be handled by a single individual. And as the process unfolds and the group gets larger, then the particular functions will be differentiated, and one individual might retain the quality management responsible role. Different people might be inspectors, and different people might be, and another individual might be the auditor. For example, a group of tree fruit apple producers, a cooperative out in Washington, which began with just a single individual and is a co-op of 500 producers, now has 3 inspectors, and the QMR and auditor have remained the same person. So although we've identified this as eventually as a team, we want to think of these at first as individual functions, that there has to be an individual who's qualified to deliver on those functions, even if it's a person wearing multiple hats. The next step in the quality management system development is to identify external support. In the quality management system approach comes from manufacturing. And Ariane made the comment that FDA's approach to food safety comes from manufacturing. Well, the idea of working under a quality management system method does not dictate how we utilize that approach. We can adapt it to the operations and uniqueness of a biological system, which is what our farms are. But external support can come from industry sources or manufacturing sources where there is significant experience in operating quality management systems. So when we talk about identifying external support for the quality management system, it means in most cases finding local experts who understand what a quality management system is and how it operates, and can help us to take advantage of the power of that method and adapt it to our needs as farms and our needs in agriculture. The other thing that will be happening, and we're working together with USDA now, is that a template will be available for building a quality management system. So in the next phase of this process, the quality management responsible person customizes that template for the particular group. Through that process, the QMR and the farmers are likely to find other opportunities to benefit from centralization. An example of that would be creating signage that would be consistent for all the farms within the group that cover things like hand washing or break areas or the different worker and staff management processes that are essential to separate, to minimize potential for contamination in the field and during post-harvest handling. So one of the real strong opportunities that the quality management system process opens up, even by beginning with food safety, it will lead us potentially to other opportunities for benefit within the group. When we say the group determines compliance methods, that means that we determine standard operating procedures. And again, the consistency that can be attained where each farm doesn't have to figure out its own standard operating procedures, but the quality management person helps, working with the farmers, helps develop a set of those compliance methods, and everyone agrees to follow them. And then next, the quality management responsible person has the skill and training to maintain the system as a document, and eventually that system is presented to a technical service provider for review to be sure that it is a complete system and can be audited as a complete system. Now, in parallel to the development of the quality management system, the farmers have to be trained. And this is generally GAP training. This is not much different in a group than it would be for individual farm certification. That's why we often have found in talking to our group partners that they are doing, food hubs and producer co-ops are doing much of the work that in relation to their farmers and their members that needs to be done within a group certification framework. However, without the quality management system to hold that process together, presented as a whole, and the addition of internal personnel for audit and inspection, even though all this training is being carried out by the group with its members, at the end the members are still incurring the costs individually in order to attain certification. So the outreach involved in farmer training is to find a qualified trainer and develop a relationship there, develop training materials, identify all the necessary participants, and then to get to work training the farmers. So this is, oh, that one jumped ahead all by itself. How did it know that? It went back by itself. Well, give me the next factor slide. I'll be fine with that. The next step is that we've got our farmers trained or in a training program. The farmers are implementing their good agricultural practice improvements, developing on-farm manuals, developing the sort of documentation that allows them to document their best practices, and then the next step is that the internal auditors and inspectors need to be trained. So like with any other system, there have to be training records, there has to be information to support how the training is carried out, and in this scenario where we're working together with USDA AMS, the intention is that the group's internal auditors and inspectors will have access to USDA training so that there will be some consistency in the training process and some verification that training requirements have been met. At this stage, all individual member farms are inspected by the internal auditors. The data can then be made available to buyers. The buyers review the reports. This is part of the essential process in which buyers move away from the expectation that each farm has an external audit and begin to accept the credibility and validity of the internal audit and the internal inspection. After adjustments or suggestions from the buyer, commerce continues or in some cases begins. The last step is having completed the internal audits of all the farms, having developed the internal quality management system and completed the training of the necessary parties, be they individuals or be they separate individuals or a single individual wearing multiple hats, then the system as a whole is ready for third-party audit. So the third-party audit is organized and, if you will, negotiated between the quality management responsible person and the USDA AMS personnel. This is the example that another example where the creation of the group project offers a buffer between the individual farm and the external agency. The individual farmers are free to do their work, which is farm and pack and deliver their product, and the quality management responsible party working on their behalf makes all the necessary arrangements, working with USDA to have the system audited and to work towards meeting any requirements uncovered by USDA during that process. At that point, USDA, if the review has been conducted and USDA is convinced that the group is ready, then they send out their auditors. So first there's an audit process with USDA to be sure the group is ready before anyone is sent out into the field. This is an important potential opportunity for saving. One of the biggest unanticipated costs for an individual farm seeking GAP certification would be calling for an audit when it's not yet ready for one and having to incur re-audit costs or other costs for follow-up in order to attain compliance. So having the group work together as a collective and having the quality management responsible and internal expert working on their behalf, that allows the group to make the progress it needs and to be in a position for a successful audit when it calls for that third-party audit from USDA. And the last step, like in any certification process, is we expect over time to work with USDA to have the group certification process itself reviewed and evaluated by yet a different third party, which could be a international standard organization approved audit or something of that sort. The idea being that the group certification process in and of itself has to be understood as being effective in all of its steps, including the USDA's own implementation of it. That's a very long-term maintenance factor, but it brings another layer of assurance to the process. So the challenges, whoops, I think I went one slide too far. Sorry. The challenges to individual groups wanting to utilize the group approach to on-farm certification. The initial challenge is finding funding support for the startup phase. I mentioned that at the very beginning of these of my slides, that the creation of a quality management system, the training of these internal subject matter experts, the identifying and hiring of them, and the impact of adding this system to an organization has some cost. It's very difficult to imagine a group fulfilling all of those costs simply out of operations. And in many respects, one could say that those costs are being shifted from the individual farms into the group. So some mechanism needs to be found to support those costs. Ideally, along with the funding for the startup phase, comes as part of the group's plan a method for carrying forward and maintaining its costs after the startup phase. Those could be met through some kind of self-assessment, but it would be unwise to continue to depend on grant or external funding to support the ongoing work of quality management system implementation after its first year. The next challenge is finding quality management system responsible parties and partners in your locale. That will be touched on a little bit in the final slide, but to put it simply, we don't always see who these folks are. In some cases, it could be someone who is either a farmer or in the family of a farmer who maybe has some experience with this kind of system approach. It could be someone with more of an accounting or auditing skill, some history in that kind of work. A lot of times in the larger produce companies, the people who work in human resources or the people who work in product quality management become identified as likely and able to help develop food safety systems. The next big challenge is understanding the system itself. I can only imagine how difficult it may be for you all hearing this presentation to integrate all of the ideas as fast as they're coming to you. The good news is that you can read the report which this presentation is drawn from at your own speed and at your own time. But ultimately, the acceptance of the system approach will depend on our ability to communicate its value and its effectiveness to buyers, to growers, and that it be also understood within the hub itself. So these are really the challenges in moving away from the challenges at the individual group level to moving away from the one farm, one field, one audit approach and into a group approach. For the Wallace Center, working with USDA AMS, what we're doing to support the development and implementation of group good agricultural practice certification is that we meet together every other month. This meeting includes stakeholders from several different divisions within USDA and is hosted by the Wallace Center. And we are also working through that group to shape the process of creating this group certification program to meet the needs of food hubs, their value chain partners, and also of producer cooperatives. So our involvement at the Wallace Center is a response to USDA AMS's recognition that this group certification program is needed and has value. And so by our involvement, we're working to be sure that the program as developed is tailored as much as it can be to food hubs and their needs. Another aspect of our work at this time is we're working with potential groups operating as pilot projects and with emerging groups. The USDA AMS has a timeline in mind to make this certification program available to the public as a market-ready product. That goal is to offer a market-ready product in the next calendar year, 2014. So currently, what we're doing at Wallace Center is working with potential pilots and individual groups to get them involved in this process with us so that we can have as much input as possible into USDA's development of the product based on real-world experience and real learnings from existing groups that are committed to this approach. So that also leads us to an awful lot of outreach and education, such as what we're doing here today, and we're interested always in finding ways to bring information about this group approach out into the food hub and local and regional food system community. And when our eventual goal is to develop a community of practice around the group certification process, where groups are able to learn from one another, share what their ups and downs have been through the process, and benefit from one another's experience so that we can create more robust systems that meet buyer requirements and do not unduly burden the farmer members that are involved in supplying our food hubs and our local food value chains. Last slide. Okay, and so in the larger level picture of this process which we are engaged in with USDA, the needs of the group GAP system is that we continue to identify key regional and national collaborators. This means that that groups or service provider organizations or agricultural support organizations that recognize the need and value for this approach, we want to continue reaching out to those and including them in our process. We also can see another level of funding that needs to be developed. Ultimately, the creation of quality management systems that are specific to farms and food hubs is going to require another type of support resources. We will be uncovering and specifying those resource needs as we work through this year's group projects. And there will also be a technical assistance need or a system of advising or guiding folks who are competent in quality management systems but are trying to bring that skill into agriculture for the first time. And this leads us to what I've come to call the gap in gap. Food safety and food safety requirements, be they regulatory or be they originating with buyers, those requirements are going to be ever present with us for quite some time as we adapt to the need of these entities for verification of on-farm good agricultural practice. The missing link is the personnel, the bridge people who are committed to and understand the practices of organic and sustainable and local and regional oriented food production on diverse farms of any scale, and the needs of these regulators or buyers and these more external systems. There's a hole in the education system right now where students coming out of microbiology backgrounds might not even realize that there is good and valuable career opportunities in food safety on farms. So the gap in gap, and another level of this gap is the expected explosion of demand for auditors and inspectors who will typically come in without agricultural experience. So what we're facing in the short term is the need to find ways to encourage building a whole new career path around both the inspection and the training of farms in good agricultural practice, where the foundation of some aspects of the practice come from a science that most of us as farmers really don't need to fully delve into the details of. So those are the overall system needs for the Group GAP project as it becomes a nationally available product. And with that, I'd like to close. I see there's a few more minutes on the call, on the webinar. I want to turn the call back to Jeff to see how we can address any questions in these last few minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, there are many questions, of course. We asked for it, and you all delivered. I did want to point out that Ariane has been answering some of the detailed questions in text form. So if you look in your questions box, you can, if you've noticed, you can scroll up, and there are some details there. Ariane, you also said you wanted to mention some resources for people about those details.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff. A lot of the questions that I received were questions about the exemptions and the thresholds, the income thresholds, and do they just apply to produce, they apply to all food. And I just want to start out by saying that the rules are very complex, and that challenge that I mentioned in one of my last slides about how the two rules interact is really a challenge in trying to also determine who is actually going to be covered by which rule and how much. It's essentially one of those kind of clear as mud situations, and we're actually have a number of legal folks helping us out to make sure that we really are clear on who is coming under which requirements. But in terms of the other resources available, I will say that the Food and Drug Administration website right now has some summaries of the rules that they are using and putting out. And they also have some of their webinars available on the website. That's www.sda.gov/FSMA. And then if you sign up to the link that I had on my slide, the sustainableagriculture.net/FSMA, so for the Food Safety Modernization Act, we'll be putting out some resources in the next few weeks through that and through the rest of our website, just with more information about the proposed rules as well, because they are complex and there are a lot of questions around what the income thresholds actually mean, and if you come under the 500,000, it is for all of the food on the farm, but then, you know, if you're just the 25,000, what does that mean? So we will be posting some of those resources. We've been waiting a little bit because we do have 1,700 pages of proposed rules to be working through, and we're going to be getting some clarification soon from FDA itself on some of these questions. So that'll help us be able to more properly inform folks about what is actually in the proposed rules. And I will just add that if folks are concerned about the thresholds or concerned about anything else or interested in getting engaged in the process, I would say now is really the time, the next few months, because these are proposed rules. They're not final rules. And so FDA has been very tentative in the way it's written the rules, and they're asking for lots of comments on lots of different parts of the proposed rules. So I would encourage everyone to sign up through our website or to sign up through, you know, your local and state organizations and get engaged in the comment process.
Great. Yeah, very important. Steve, we have someone who's read the Good Natured Family Farm Group Gap Pilot Report and quotes us as saying on page 30, "No one wants to be the farmer that causes the demise of the whole group." So can you address what happens if there's a recall? Does the whole group get shut down? Are farmers eliminated from the group? How does it work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in fact, in most of the concerns that have been brought forward, it has been that sort of a concern where one bad apple, so to speak. Well, first of all, even through the internal capacity building, implementation, and inspection process, all of these layers make it possible to identify and minimize any potential noncompliances. The theory of preventive food safety is that our job is to avoid risk, not eliminate it. So the strength of the group approach is that we actually prevent our farmers from being exposed to undue external scrutiny of those potential noncompliances by dealing with all the capacity building, let's so to say, in-house. Now, traceability is a critical part of everything that we will be doing in food safety as individual farms and of everything that we're doing in food hubs. Once a product within a group system, that once we are able to properly track where a product came from and who it went to, that allows us to limit any of the requirements or any of a recall or of a stoppage in product movement. So again, the creation of internal capacity always improves the ability of the group to protect itself as a whole, and it's understood that if there is ever a problem, it will be at an individual location rather than system-wide.
Okay. There are several questions. Oh,
Yes,
sure. Go ahead.
there might be just a little bit more to say real quick, which is
Yeah.
that even if an external audit were to come in and review the work of the internal group inspections, what it's doing is inspecting a percentage of the membership. What it's looking for is consistency. If the internal inspections are then consistent with the spot checks that the external auditor conducts, then that shows that the system as a whole has integrity. And that's what the purpose of the external audit is. It's not to re-inspect every farm. But if there were to be a non-compliance that was found in that re-inspection or spot check process, unless it was of extremely critical and public health threatening nature, then the normal process would be followed in which the non-compliance was identified and the farmer given time to respond. Now let's think also about the mechanism of a group. If we're working together in a group and we have a chronic offender, that becomes the group's responsibility to make a decision whether that individual's product can be trusted. And chances are, if it can't be trusted from a good agricultural practice standpoint, there would be other reasons why it can't be trusted either. But the key point to consider is that we are dealing with our improvement process, we're dealing with our capacity building process, we're dealing with it internally with an additional layer of resources that are not available if we're functioning on our own as individual and separate farms.
Speaking of the group, there are questions. Several people have asked, what is the appropriate group structure? So someone asked if the group should be one united LLC. People asked if producer cooperatives could be a good group. Someone asked about if a farmer's market or a farmer's market manager could be the sort of centralized point for a group for those farmers that are at the market. Why don't you talk about what the structure of a group can be?
Well, in the global context, a group for purposes of certification has to be a legally formed entity, and Global Gap provides rules that a group must meet in order to become qualified as a group. Part of what we're doing in this process with USDA now is pointing out that here in the United States, farmers associate, in other words, work together collectively in a much wider range of forms than strictly legal entities. So what would happen is that the quality management system document itself would include the group's self-definition and its essentially its rationale for why it can be treated and worked with as a group. So we would anticipate that while a legally formed cooperative of some sort or a legally formed entity would certainly be the easiest way to identify a group, that a less structured and less formal association could work if it is able to define itself clearly enough that it can meet the requirements, it can present and maintain a quality management system. This is actually one of the innovations that I think we will bring to the global community, is that only legal entities are not likely to be the only ones who can function as effective and credible groups.
Great. One point of information, what is the difference between an auditor and an inspector?
Well, the auditor is more of a desk type role where the auditor is reviewing the inspections. An inspector is strictly a field person. Very clearly, someone could do both. But for example, what an auditor would do is gather the field reports, look for inconsistencies at the field report level. A good example of that is that when an inspector goes out to the field and goes out to a farm and sees that all of the record keeping is in the same color pen, looks like it was written the night before, and clearly wasn't created as the events unfolded. That's the sort of stuff that an auditor would be looking for as they review their internal inspections. So again, if the group grows to the point where there are multiple inspectors, then the audit process becomes more important internally because we're still looking for consistency and fairness in the auditing process. We're looking for any irregularities and to try to address and minimize them because we want to find those internally before we call for an external verification. If they exist, we want to find them internally. So audit is more of a paper function, and inspector is totally a physical field site visit approach.
Thanks. Ariane, Keith has a question about the definition of on-farm processing. For example, does rinsing lettuce or cutting beetroots, trimming carrots constitute on-farm processing?
Keith, you've hit on the key questions around what it means to be a farm and what it means to be a processor. So originally in the kind of former regulations around some of this stuff, pretty much all the activities that you listed were considered to be processing on farm, and now FDA in these proposed rules is trying to clarify some of that, and there are lists of activities that they're saying are part of kind of regular on-farm production and harvesting and kind of preparing for transport and distribution. And some of the key distinctions that are made about those things are really on whether the farm is doing those activities on the farm's own product or on another farm's product. So if you're a farmer and you're doing some of those activities, and it's a pretty complex list or long list, so you know, I can answer each one of those, but I just want to first back up and say that if you're doing those activities on your own farm and your own product, then there are a few of them that fall into that processing category that then trigger the other regulations. If you're doing that on your farm on somebody else's product, so think about CSAs that aggregate product, or you know, even some food hub type situations, then you do trigger the definitions around processing. And so the distinction that FDA is now making around some of these activities are specifically about whether the activities are occurring on your own product or you're doing them on somebody else's product.
Okay. Natasha, this is a question for you, Steve. Natasha feels that group gap sounds great for small farms, but what about the very small farms, 2 to 4 acres, and urban farms, very small acreage? What about those plots? Would it work in those cases?
Well, again, coming from the global context, you know, there have been tremendous success with very small farms, and I think that actually the smaller the farm, the more impossible it would be to be certified any other way. And the reason is I'm thinking about my own farm, for example, which is pretty tiny, and if we're trying to develop our own worker training programs and our own standard operating procedures and even some of our own paperwork, the overhead associated with creating that system is disproportionate to what we can actually generate in revenue as a farm. Whereas if we're part of a group and these systems are created, are developed, even things like worker training can be carried out collectively where workers from multiple farms go to the same training. So the smaller the farm, the less likely it is that individual certification is even an option. And certainly the group approach around the world has met the needs of the smallest farms.
Steve, you want to talk about what we know about the costs involved in group gap certification?
Well, that's really hard, and I think we'll come out with more information from this year's work. You know, we know that USDA auditors, I believe, are currently charging $90 an hour from the time that they leave wherever their location is to go out to perform field audits. We have some rough estimates, you know, as to what it costs to set up a quality management system and hire and train the initial staff, be it multiple people or an individual with multiple hats. And we're roughing that number in at around $25,000. But part of our job in the Wallace Center collaboration with USDA is to find ways to get those costs down. But ultimately, individual farms are spending anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a year either preparing for or being audited and then responding to the audit. The total cost should go down per farm, but part of that will be because some of the costs are moved into the group and its functions and out of those of the individual farm. It is still possible. This kind of harkens back to the last question. is there a size at which it's just too costly even within a group? And the answer should prove to be no, but the data to support that is part of what we are trying to create through our ongoing work with interested groups at this time.
Ariane, one more question for you. Someone was asking about the collaboration that NSAC is doing with other groups for commenting on the FSMA.
Sorry, the collaboration that NSAC is doing with other groups on commenting
right.
this month.
Mm-hmm.
So right now we are going through the coalition's internal process. So like I said, we have 90 member organizations, over 90 member organizations, and many of them participate in the committee that's reviewing the rules and preparing for the grassroots comment campaign. And then in mid to late March, we'll have resources and materials available in the outreach that we do to partner organizations across the country. And we partner with many sustainable food system groups, organic groups, value-added groups, public health. I mean, we partner with a long list of allies, and so we will be doing outreach later on in March for those groups. And we will have information available also for individuals who want to comment on the rules but don't want to read them all.
Yeah, it's good bedtime reading. Many bedtimes. Okay, there are many more questions, and I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. However, I will send the questions to our panelists, and I know that NSAC is committed to making sure everyone is well educated. Ariane gave you the website, sustainableagriculture.net/FSMA, and Steve and the Wallace Center will be creating frequently asked questions about group GAP certification. So we will definitely take your questions into consideration. So apologies. But I do want to thank Ariane and Steve for some really fantastic information. This webinar is being recorded and will be archived on our website along with the 40+ other webinars we've done in the past. Feel free to send others who you think would have liked to have heard this panel and take some professional development time yourself and dig through our excellent archives. Visit ngfn.org/webinars. This webinar will be up within a few business days. You'll get an email probably on Monday with a link directly to the archive. Our webinars are organized into topics, so if you look in the left-hand navigation area, dig into whatever interests you. We offer the NGFN webinars on the third Thursday of each month at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Sign-up links are at ngfn.org/webinars. And the NGFN webinar series has been running for over 3 years. We are now able to accept donations to help support future high-quality presentations. So if you felt like you got some value out of this presentation, please consider a donation. The next webinar is not the third Thursday of March, it's the fourth Thursday of March. We will introduce a new tool created with funding from the USDA Risk Management Agency. The one-page risk management plan is designed for producers of all scales and types to hone in on the areas of greatest risk to their operations and to begin to create a plan to mitigate those risks. This is work with Farm Credit we've been doing. We will show you how to use this new tool in conjunction with the one-page business plan and one-page financial plan to increase farm success. And then in April, Lauren Gwynn, a national expert on meat processing, will present with case studies some innovative meat processing models across the country. At the national level, we have heard many times that meat processing is a bottleneck for regional protein. Lauren has some really interesting insights into this, and you don't want to miss it. So let us know in the post-webinar survey if you'd like to be automatically registered for either or both of these webinars. I want to let you know about 3 other Wallace Center websites. Foodhub.info, we've mentioned a few times this webinar. It's a food hub of information, research, case studies, a map of many of the food hubs across the country. The NGFN Food Hub Collaboration recently chose 9 food hubs across the country to work closely with and document their stories. Read about these study hubs on our site. There are links to TA providers with experience in aggregation and distribution. And the NGFN and Food Hub collaboration is building a community of practice of Food Hub managers and staff and supporters. So we have a newsletter every other month, technical assistance, networking opportunities, and more in the post-webinar survey. Indicate to us if you'd like more information about this community of practice. HuFed.org is our site for the Healthy Urban Food Enterprise Development Center run by the Wallace Center. As mentioned, this program and the website is focused on increasing access to food to underserved communities using market-based solutions. On the site, you'll find a description of the initiative, grantee profiles and photos, and a library of some of the best food access resources. If you have a resource you'd like to share, let us know. Contact at ngfn.org or hufed@winrock.org. And foodshedguide.org is our site for producers wanting to adapt to the changing food business landscape. We have instructive text and case studies with an emphasis on how to have a more viable business in the food value chain. Learn about, for instance, factors to consider when deciding on legal status, such as an LLC or C Corp. We also have the aforementioned one-page business plan and one-page financial plan up there. You can find the NGFN on YouTube, on Twitter, and on our website, ngfn.org, and now on Facebook. The Wallace Center is Wallace Center at Winrock International on Facebook, so come like us. Again, if you haven't already, sign up for our email updates. There's a link on the ngfn.org homepage, or just let us know in the post-webinar survey, and we'll sign you up. Please contact us at any time. Email address is contact@ngfn.org. And the NGFN would like to thank you for your time today. Once again, let me encourage you to fill out the survey that will open your web browser in just a moment. Thanks. This concludes the webinar.